Good evening and welcome to another session of the Awarelogue Lecture Forum. We're indeed honored today to have with us someone who is a specialist in the particular field that we have selected, which is public diplomacy in the 21st century. Dr. Etienne F is someone whom I met many years ago in the Netherlands. Whilst on a program, he is affiliated with the Klingendale, but he's also very well known as a very senior lecturer in the Department of Media and Communication. He received his doctorate from the École des Hautes Études in Sciences Sociales in Paris. After his master's in film studies from the Sorbonne in Paris, he also studied political science at the Institut d'études politiques de Grenoble, film studies at the University of California, and cultural studies at the London Consortium, affiliated with the University of London. He's a former chairperson of the Mass Communication Department of the University of Balamon near Tripoli. He taught for close to 10 years at universities in various parts of the world, especially at universities in Lebanon, in the Czech Republic, in Austria, in Slovakia, and he's also at the Oxford University. He has several publications to his name, and we are indeed honored that he has taken time to join us today and to be a part of this Awarelogue Lecture Forum. Thank you very much, Dr. Etienne F, for taking time to join us. Over to you to speak to us about public diplomacy in the 21st century.
Thank you very much. And I'm sharing my screen right now. I hope it works. Is it okay? Yep.
Yes, it is shared.
Okay.
Yes, we can see.
Okay. Wonderful. So it's my pleasure to be here with you today. It's a rainy day today in the Netherlands as usual. So I'm happy to spend it with you. We're going to speak about public diplomacy in the 21st century. And I'm very appreciative of the invitation. I'm very happy to be here. Yesterday, again, I did an online session for Klingendale for diplomats from Caribbean and Latin America. And what I want to do with you today is something slightly different from what I do usually. In general, I speak about public diplomacy today. I speak about practicing public diplomacy. I speak about what public diplomacy is about today. And I would like to discuss more what public diplomacy might be in the future with you, not just public diplomacy, but also, it's quite ambitious, what the world could be in the future. But before this, I'm not completely sure that you heard about public diplomacy. Maybe you have, maybe you haven't. But public diplomacy today, when I explain what public diplomacy is at Klingendale, I always use first a definition from the United States Information Agency, saying that public diplomacy is promoting the national interest of the US through understanding, informing, and influencing foreign audiences. But since I'm training heavily in Klingendale and I get to meet people from all over the world, literally, I usually use something which is slightly different. My working definition is public relations applied to diplomacy. I served in an embassy. I studied in an embassy a long time ago. Many years ago, I was in Beirut serving for the French embassy. And already we're practicing public diplomacy, except it didn't really have a name. I mean, public diplomacy is not something new, but it's been theorized just for a few decades only. So for me, public diplomacy is public relations applied to diplomacy, which means that it's part of something larger, which is strategic mass communication and not so much diplomacy. So basically, it's at the intersection of strategic mass communication and diplomacy. But my favorite definition, what I like to speak about, is more the idea of public diplomacy as seduction of nations, how you can actually have one country or even one city or place seduce other people. Usually I speak about tourists, about expats, about students, about all the people that you want to attract. I really like public diplomacy, I have to say. I started mostly working in propaganda, researching propaganda for 20 years, but more and more I research public diplomacy, which is quite similar. I like public diplomacy very much because it allows smaller countries, smaller nations to also tell their stories. I'm a huge believer in bringing peace. I'm a huge believer in diplomacy. I mentioned before that I served in an embassy in Lebanon, and during the 2006 war, we could see that anything should be done in the world to prevent wars. War is something absolutely horrible. I'm afraid that I've seen it maybe from too close. And today, when I speak about public diplomacy, it's also a way for me to say, well, we have to bring countries together. And one of the best ways is to have them tell their stories and seduce other people so that they also understand there's not just one cultural model in the world. Now, public diplomacy stems also for one idea, which is do not wait for others to tell your story. For a very simple reason, if you wait for others, if you don't tell your story first, somebody else will. I like to use the work of another scholar, the wonderful Umberto Eco that you can see on the screen. Umberto Eco was a semiotician, and he was also a novelist. Sorry, I think there's a microphone that is still open. Umberto Eco was a novelist and a semiotician, and in one of his books about hyperreality, he went to Las Vegas, he went to a lot of places where things are represented by science. And he said 70% of what we know comes from Hollywood. And unfortunately today, as much as I like Hollywood and I can speak about Hollywood for quite a long time, I even teach film studies at university. I have to say that very often we take the reality of the world from Hollywood movies or Hollywood TV shows. It's a bit of an issue because even for American, when you look at American films, Hollywood films and Hollywood TV shows, this is not about the real America. This is not about the real US. I was lucky enough to live a little bit in the United States. And when I look at the difference between reality and perception from movies, I can see there's a huge discrepancy. So you can imagine also the discrepancy between representation of countries on Hollywood TV shows and films and the reality. So public diplomacy is very important because it's about projecting your story. It's about seducing other people. It's about making sure that your country will be considered well with a positive reputation by investors, by students, by expats. And that's the core of public diplomacy. But now, one of the things, so I promised today I will speak about the futures of public diplomacy, but I'm going to speak about what happened recently, which is COVID-19. As you know, well, there were some extremely bad things with COVID-19. Millions of people, it seems I read this morning that 5 million people died of COVID one way or the other, which is a huge pandemic. But also our way of life got affected and we realized that we're very fragile. But if we speak about the positive, there is some positive in the sense that now doing a Zoom session is something that became very normal for many people around the world. COVID is going to change everything, hopefully for the best. One thing is for sure, COVID-19 is changing public diplomacy already, because when we speak about the seduction of nations and the reputation of countries, you can already see that COVID-19 changed it. I'm going to use a report by Bloom Consulting that says that COVID-19 had a huge impact on nation brands. Nation brands in a sense of how countries are trying to project themselves to the world. Those who don't succeed have nation brand. Those who succeed are called nation branding. So COVID-19 already changed a lot because if you look at this study by Bloom Consulting, you can see that some countries actually benefited in terms of reputation from COVID-19. I'm trying to be very measured here, but South Korea is probably the country that benefited the most in a sense that automatically when the pandemic started, South Korea was very fast to protect its citizens. Same for Germany, Singapore, Japan, Taiwan, and Australia. On the other hand, some countries were not that efficient when it comes to protecting their people and also the foreigners on their territory. And that's the case of Brazil, China, United Kingdom, Spain, Italy, and United States. Most probably in the future, those countries are going to suffer when it comes to their reputation because they were not able to protect their people and the foreigners on their soil during the pandemic. So COVID-19 is changing already everything. So when it comes to the future of public diplomacy, already we can see that there will be some changes because of the pandemic that lasted for more than 2 years. Now, what I also wanted to explain is that when it comes to reputation, it's something that you have to build. Public diplomacy is about also building a solid reputation year after year, decade after decade, and sometimes century after century. And the idea of resilience is very important because if you have a country brand or country branding, indeed, when you have a crisis, you have to demonstrate that you are able to navigate through this crisis and make sure that the reputation is not affected. So the futures of public diplomacy, usually when I have sessions in public diplomacy at Cleandale, I have diplomats, I have civil servants from, like I said before, all around the world. But this is where I sort of stop, in a sense that I explain technical details, how you can actually modify work on the perception, reputation using rankings. I speak about different types of concepts from propaganda to disinformation to misinformation. But this is where I stop. I don't really speak about the futures of public diplomacy. I wanted to save that for you today. And hopefully we can have a good Q&A after to discuss what I'm about to present. Futures of public diplomacy. The thing is, we lived in a world that was sort of very quiet for almost 2 centuries when it comes to diplomacy. Diplomacy has been pretty much the same for 200 years. But now public diplomacy is changing the game, but also some of the tools of public diplomacy are literally changing everything. One of them is called computational propaganda. Now, propaganda, I didn't explain it before, but for me, the propaganda is the control of people's beliefs. It's not something negative at all. I really like propaganda in the sense that it's a tool, it's a very powerful tool. It's a sword, if you will. And just like any sword, it can be used to attack or to defend. So with propaganda, you can do a lot of things. Propaganda is not negative. Before, propaganda was used by usually large corporations, large organizations, in order to convince large amount of people. But comes something called computational propaganda, and we speak about the past years. And computational propaganda is when you use algorithm, automation, bots, and now you have the capacity, one individual has the capacity to actually run a whole propaganda campaign to convince other people and to control their beliefs. And you can do that with like large amount of people, very large amount of people, or just target one individual after the other. It's a huge, huge, huge change in the game of strategic mass communication. All of a sudden, in a way, smaller countries which don't have, let's say, the financial firepower of the big five at the UN, have the capacity now to use computational propaganda to develop their public policy. I like to repeat it once again, propaganda for me is not negative. It all depends on what you're going to do with it. So computational propaganda is indeed a game changer when it comes to public diplomacy because it really enables smaller individuals, smaller countries, smaller companies to develop a large-scale mass communication campaign worldwide. But the other thing I want to discuss before I go further is a concept that is not really new. It's from the 50s. The US Department of Defense started to speak about perception management. Now, so far I spoke about reputation of countries. You do understand that, of course, it's impossible to have a ranking saying this is the best country in the world, followed by this one, by this one, by this one. But indeed, individuals, whether they are students or investors or expats or any kind of people that may travel to your country, of course, they have their own personal ranking based on many different factors. And usually those factors are extremely subjective. Subjective because today it's impossible to know the world. It's not possible. We know the world through the media. We know the world through representations. Hollywood is one of them. And so since the 50s, the US Department of Defense has started to work on something called perception management. And it's something that has been used also by US politicians. I would like to remind you of Karl Rove. I don't know if you've ever heard of him, but he was nicknamed the architect, and he was the spin doctor, understand, the PR specialist of George W. Bush. And as the specialist in public relations of George W. Bush, he was someone that actually came up with a whole strategy that led to people thinking that George Bush was from Texas. He's not, he's from Connecticut. And he was not very smart. He was actually much smarter than presented. But Karl Rove sort of designed George W. Bush so that he will be elected as some kind of self-made man. Pretty much the same tactic actually worked for Donald Trump. But to return to Karl Rove, at one point he said something. Well, he never acknowledged that he said that, but he said, we're an empire now. When we act, we create our own reality. Now I'm going to stop at it. You can read the rest of the quote. We are an empire now. When we act, we create our own reality. This concept is very interesting for me because when it comes to public diplomacy, I always get the question, which is it actually possible to change the image of the country? And my answer is, it is possible. In a sense that reality at some point matters. You cannot lie to people. You cannot promise them things that they will not encounter. But indeed, you can also have some kind of twist on the perception. But then comes perception management. And this sentence by Karl Rove saying we're an empire now. When we act, we create our own reality makes me, in the same time, very excited, but also very scared in a sense that all of a sudden it's actually possible to act on the reality. Now, slowly, the reality that we speak of is becoming virtual. I spoke very briefly about the category of people that you can reach with public diplomacy, the students, the expats, the investors, the tourists, of course. When they come to a country, of course, they expect something, meaning that you cannot lie about reality. You can sort of spin the reality in a certain way, in the sense of push forward something that you believe will be better for the reputation of the country. But the thing is, reality is becoming more and more virtual. I mean, something that we've never witnessed in the history of the world. Reality is becoming virtual. And the thing is, public diplomacy is only practiced if nations can communicate, I will say, in the physical world. But what happens if nations cannot communicate? That's also something I hear a lot when I do trainings at Clean Air. Well, we don't have the firepower of the United States or France. How can we actually get a story heard? Well, it is very much possible, thanks in part to social media, but also to different ways of spreading your story. But can public diplomacy still be effective if indeed nations are isolated? Now, you probably heard recently that Donald Trump, since he was banned from Twitter and most social media, decided to create his own social media. And I thought it was extremely interesting. And actually, my students at Erasmus University, where I'm principal lecturer, teaching mostly mass communication, but also other things like future studies, my students presented this very recently, and they had an interesting question. They presented, so they have to do a press review every week. And they say, well, Trump is going to have his own social media called Truth, about Donald Trump, Truth, which is quite ironic if you know the character that he called it Truth. But anyway, students said, well, how many of you will be interested to join? And I was the only one who raised my hand. I said, well, of course, I want to join for a simple reason. I want to know what he's going to say. I want to be part of it because I want to understand what's happening. So definitely, I'm not going to boycott it. And if I get an invitation, I will be very happy. But this is quite interesting because social media, so far, we were told that social media are global, they're everywhere. It's about billions of users, especially Facebook and Snapchat and WhatsApp and all of those social media. But what if actually more and more we were talking about community social media? Now we know, for instance, that Facebook is not allowed in certain countries in the world. Not all American social media are allowed. So those countries then have to create their own social media. But so far the phenomenon was, I would say, marginal, in a sense that so far most social media were controlled by Americans, but by Americans that had everybody open, in a sense that the social media will be open to everyone. What will happen if indeed you have social media, but they do not communicate between each other? I speak about this because recently also Facebook, speaking about social media, decided to introduce something called the Metaverse. And they're going to hire 10,000 people, at least they claim to hire 10,000 people in the EU to work on the Metaverse. And it might be a shift of scene. It might be a way for Facebook to actually divert the attention of people because they're under heavy fire because of the Facebook papers. It seems that Facebook is encouraging some behavior that will come in the physical world. So Facebook said we're going to hire 10,000 people in the EU. So of course, in the EU, people seem very excited. But what for? The Metaverse. First of all, recently on October 28th, Facebook decided to change its name to become Meta. So they're going to focus heavily on the Metaverse. I don't know if you heard about Metaverse, but I think it's an extremely interesting notion, something that is at the same time exciting and also frightening. The Metaverse will be a convergence of the physical world in which we live, plus the augmented reality. So, you know, augmented reality is something that you can see when using your smartphone or when you use special goggles, and also virtual reality. So all those universes will actually be merged into one metaverse. Now, the metaverse is not a new idea. It's coming from someone called Neil Stevenson. Actually, it's not coming from him. Like I said before, I teach future studies. I also teach science fiction. And the notion of the metaverse, spelled differently, existed before Neil Stevenson. But Neil Stevenson wrote a book or wrote a novel called Snow Crash. Neil Stevenson is a great science fiction writer, but also he's one of the advisors of Blue Origin, which is the company of Jeff Bezos from Amazon. Now, Snow Crash is a very complicated story. Usually when I advise people to read science fiction, and I do that all the time, I do not advise to read Neil Stevenson, not so much because he's a bad writer, but because it's quite complex. For people who don't like science fiction, never heard of science fiction, I do recommend some other authors which are easier. But in Snow Crash, Neil Stevenson is speaking about the metaverse, and he says, well, imagine, you have the definition once again here, but imagine like our planet, and on this planet, you have like all around the planet, you have the street. The street is running for the whole circumference of a spherical planet. So it's actually slightly smaller than Earth. And inside of this ribbon, let's call it a ribbon, it's called the street, but it's inside of this ribbon, it's both a physical and also virtual place with also augmented reality. It's very complicated, but already in 1992, when the book is released, this virtual real estate is owned by the Global Multimedia Protocol Group, which sounds very much like Facebook, which is now called Meta. Now, the reason why I'm mentioning this, why I'm mentioning also science fiction, is that it's something that has always been part of science fiction. The idea of creating a different universe, parallel universe, something that is digital. For instance, in Ready Player One, released in 2011, also, we speak about the future, 2040. Most people in the world live in virtual reality that is owned by giant evil corporation. And they spend most of their time in this oasis. And I have a clip for that. I hope that it works. Yes, I think so.
Etienne, maybe you need to share the sound.
I think yeah, I didn't have the option when they say shared. I didn't have the option to share the sound. I don't know why.
On the bar?
Anywho,
yeah.
It's not really important. The clip is not really important. It's important because this idea of metaverse sounds great, sounds scary, sounds exciting, sounds like everything you want. But the thing is, what would happen if actually some countries refuse to cooperate? Some countries refuse to be part of it. Some societies won't be in this. Metaverse sounds like some parallel universe owned by Meta or some other companies, which can sort of be scary because sometimes we are very happy to have private accounts, but when it comes to an entire universe, we're not completely sure. I mean, if you look at the history of all the countries in the world, we've been through revolution, we've been through evolution, we've been through a lot of changes. And today, well, we have different system of government, but most of them are public in the sense that they are in the hands of people. What would happen if they were in the hand of private company first? But second, also, what would happen if you only concern like a bunch of countries, but not the rest? One of the phenomenon that I find also very exciting in terms of public diplomacy is the fact that more and more countries in the world are going through virtual isolation, meaning that probably they will not be part of the metaverse. That's the case for Russia. Ru.net. Russia wants to isolate itself. It wants to unplug from the internet. They accuse the internet, the World Wide Web at least, to be mostly controlled by the Americans, which is partly true, but also by Europe, which is also very much true. And so Russia has made some tests to be sure that they can keep the sovereignty over their own internet. They know that they cannot run the internet, they cannot run the World Wide Web because it's too complicated. So they want to be sure that they maintain a certain level of control over the internet. And for them, the best way to do that is to isolate themselves. And it seems that they're working on it with the help of companies like Apple and Google. Now, this is interesting, but it's something that has been done before and has been done at a much larger scale by the People's Republic of China. So the People's Republic of China also is experimenting something called the Great Firewall of China, and they've been working on it for decades. And the Great Firewall of China is following some of the teaching of Xi Jinping, the leader of the People's Republic of China, in which he says that there's no distinction between the virtual world and the real world. Both should reflect the same political values, ideals, and standards. Except we know that today it's not possible. The World Wide Web is anarchy at the best. It's the Wild West. It's something that is complicated to control. Many countries are trying to control it. Many companies also are trying to control it. So far, I would say there is an amazing balance of power in the World Wide Web, which makes it still a place where pretty much anybody can find its space. But of course, the neutrality of the net is also at stake. And in the future, we don't know if the net will remain neutral, if it will be controlled by companies or by organizations or by governments. But if we go back to the notion of public diplomacy only works if we are able to communicate with other nations. What would happen in the future if indeed we speak about an internet that is only for communities, like Truth by Donald Trump, or if already large chunks of the world, countries like Russia, countries like China, decide to actually be removed from the World Wide Web? How can we then communicate with this country? And how would it be able then, to communicate using public diplomacy? All internet service providers in China already are licensed and controlled by the Ministry of Industry and Information Technology, meaning that every content in and out of China can be monitored and manipulated by the Chinese authorities. So the Great Firewall of China is something that we have to be very careful about. I'm not saying that it's a threat. Well, China is a sovereign country. They do what they believe they have to do. But the most interesting for us is that not only do they control the production of data in China, but also the production of data coming into China. And I think when it comes to public diplomacy, it changes the game completely. Let's say that you have a whole strategy in order to promote your country one way or the other, let's say through gastro diplomacy, and you want to reach a certain number of countries, including China. The thing is, you will not know what in the end people will receive, though you have the control of the campaign at the very beginning. You have absolutely no idea how the campaign will be received in China. I'm going to stop sharing. These are some of the ideas that I have for us today. And now I'll be happy to take questions if there are any from you. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you. Thank you so very much. The floor is open. Please feel free to send in your questions via the chat box. You can always type them in there. And we will be fielding them to Dr. Augé in the course of the next half an hour. Etienne, just to go back to some of the points that you raised and just to ask you about a particular issue that comes up, we understand that now communication, all the areas that you mentioned, it is Meta, whether it we go back to talking about Facebook, whether it is Twitter or any of the social media platforms, aren't we beginning to see non-state actors taking over? We're obviously in an era in which state actors are taking a back seat. And it is the non-state actors who are coming forward. I guess Donald Trump as the individual, when he promotes a new platform as truth and he puts it out, he becomes a non-state actor as well because he's not part of the state anymore. Now, aren't we seeing, whether it's Google, whether it's Apple, non-state actors are really coming to the forefront? I guess Ronald Reagan's administration promoted this when they wanted the private sector, when they wanted non-governmental organizations given more financial support, especially through banking institutions, etc. So we saw this in the 80s as well. But aren't you seeing in the 21st century, the state actor is taking a back seat or is being forced into a back seat, whilst the steering is now being done by the non-state actors?
I think this is, of course, a very complex question that we could discuss for quite some hours. I have to say that ever since I arrived in the Netherlands, my position sort of changed in the sense that this question is also loaded with ideology, in the sense that some people might say, well, it's a good thing that you have less intervention from the government. Some people will say, no, actually, the government should be in charge of everything. I'm not even speaking about USSR. I'm speaking more about countries like Sweden, for instance. In Sweden, indeed, the control of the government is quite a grip, and the Swedes are perfectly happy with that. It seems they keep being at the top of happiest people in the world. But ever since I arrived in the Netherlands, I used to be quite French. You know, I'm half French, also half Swiss. Arriving in the Netherlands, I noticed that actually what's happening here is always a collaboration between private and public sector, and it seems to work also pretty well. So I think every country has a different way to look at the intervention of the government. Now, non-state actors, I think it started indeed in the 70s. I would say organizations like Greenpeace are quite powerful. Also terrorist organizations. I'm not going to put Greenpeace and terrorist organization on the same level, but to say there are indeed non-state actors. And I would say it could also be a good thing that you have some kind of balance of power between governments, private sector, NGOs, IGOs. To me, that's what matters, the idea of balance. Of course, balance means that they sort of control each other and that there is truly a balance of power, meaning that nobody is more powerful than the others. But at the end of the day, what should be the most important is that we as citizens of the world, we still have the control and not just the companies which are driven by profit. So the fact that now you have extremely powerful corporations like Facebook and Google and Apple, and you know that there are some talks in the United States about dismantling them, just like they did with the trust at the beginning of the 20th century, show that people are indeed aware of the problem. They're aware of the power of those companies. But to me, I'm kind of happy that they exist. I'm also kind of happy because I do believe that the private sector also can come up with great ideas, great innovations. I'm personally in awe of what Elon Musk is doing. Not sure about, I wouldn't say the same for other companies, but what Elon Musk is doing is indeed a revolution. He's going to be the richest person in the entire world. He might have $1 trillion in his wallet, which is impossible to imagine. But I'm also quite happy that he's stimulating all the organizations like NASA. So to return to the field of diplomacy, I think anyway, it's always been between state, but also non-state actors. And for me, again, being an expert, but not an authority, I believe it's a good thing. I believe it's a good thing because of the balance of power. But now we speak about something completely different in the sense that, let's imagine for a second, we live in the future and there's such a thing as the metaverse. And we actually live in the metaverse because it will be physical and augmented and virtual and everything. There's a question that we always ask in political science, which is, I will say it first in Latin, so I sound smart, quis custodiat ipsos custodis, meaning who will guard the guardians. And that's the thing. If we indeed will live in a world that is a combination of virtual and reality and augmented and everything, who's going to have the power in the future? And for this, I have absolutely no question, George, or no answer. And so to your question, non-state actors today, yes, but I think it's actually a good thing. But in the future, I cannot envision the future. I'm working on the future. I'm working on future studies and other things. I have no idea what's going to happen, but I think we have to be extremely vigilant. We have to be extremely cautious about this kind of future. And we have to make sure that our sovereignty as individual is not slipping away, that we become so lazy and so comfortable that we sort of give the power to decide for our life to companies whose purpose is profit. And I don't believe that Facebook was created to make the world a better place, though it does in a way. Facebook or LinkedIn are actually very interesting social media, very useful, at least from my point of view. But I don't think for a second that they have our best interest in mind. So that's more the future. I wouldn't say I'm concerned. Well, yeah, I'm concerned. I'm cautious. I'm not scared, but I don't really know what the future holds. And that makes it very exciting and also something that pushes us to remain on our toes.
Exactly. It certainly does. Because one thing that we saw with the Trump presidency, when President Trump started tweeting, we really became that much more aware of Twitter. If you wanted to know American policy, if you wanted to know where the country was going, following his tweets was actually quite instrumental during his presidency. We also had that in India, where you had India's foreign minister at the time, the external affairs minister, Sushma Swaraj, who was also very active on Twitter. She was even labeled the minister of Twitter in that country. Of course, Trump is not in the picture anymore. Ms. Swaraj is not in the picture anymore either. But in the future, aren't we going to see a complete transition there into social media for states? And states have to get on board. Whether they like it or not, they're going to have to evolve. This is going back to Charles Darwin, I guess, the species that survived were the species that evolved. Unless governments, ministers, officials, diplomats, everybody gets onto social media, aren't we going to face a huge problem? Because as you said, the information is out there. We're not going to be privy to it. As you said, you want to get onto truth. I'm very keen to get onto it as well, because we need to know, even if we may not agree with it, you need to know it.
Yeah, absolutely. But I would say for us, maybe it's more important than other people, because it's also part of the job to monitor what's happening. So that also explains why every day I have to read several newspapers from New York Times, Guardian, Le Monde, and everything. But one thing that I noticed is probably the reason why social media on the rise, and you're absolutely right that Donald Trump was using Twitter, and then Twitter became important also thanks to Trump. So, you know, in a way, they've been ungrateful because Donald Trump attracted a lot of attention to them. To be on social, first of all, the first problem I identify is that social media is not a good term because they're not social and they're not media. That's also one of the biggest problems, that one of the biggest issues. They don't produce information, they produce data. And I recently wrote an article for Cleandale where I was explaining a bit about future studies. And I came across a statistic saying that by 2020, we have produced a certain amount of data, which is absolutely massive, but it will be less than the amount of data we're going to produce in 2025 alone. So in 1 year, we'll have produced more data than the whole data, the whole history. And so the problem is the following. We produce a lot of data that we have to transform into information. And then the information should be knowledge. For instance, I will never place on the same level the fact that one of the Kardashian has a new boyfriend and what's happening right now in Glasgow. They're both data, but one I would consider to be an information, the other one, not so much. But we produce a lot of data. And so far, the guardians were the journalists, were the scholars, were people that were in charge of dealing with data, making information. But the problem is that, first of all, not all of us are doing a good job, journalists or scholars or people in charge of information. And second thing is that it's becoming exponential.
In countries as well. Saranya sends in the question in terms of talking about public diplomacy, asking the question, is public diplomacy for all? And I guess she's referring to the finances involved in engagement in public diplomacy. Countries are trying to, Etienne, I'm sure you're aware of this, in European countries or in America or in other countries in the West, when you go into developing countries, you're obviously having very good cordial relations with the leadership of the country. It's very easy to reach out to them. And so you're reaching out into the public domain. But of course, when developing countries are going into some of the more developed countries, we're coming into a situation where you're clamoring to get in contact with the leadership first. You're trying to reach out to those in power, those in authority. Reaching into the public domain might be something you would do later on your list of priorities. You're trying to get that appointment with the president, with the prime minister, with the minister, hopefully even with the secretary. Hence, she's asking this question. I guess it's quite a loaded question there when she says, is public diplomacy for all?
That's an excellent point. That's also why I enjoy so much doing this kind of event where I can actually get some feedback from other places, because we tend to be a bit too focused on the Western world. That also includes Japan and of course Oceania. And so, well, I lived outside of Europe for quite a while. I lived in the Middle East for 12 years. I also lived in Central Europe and other places. So I know that things are not the same everywhere. But you raise a very interesting point that actually I should make more important in my training in Clean Air, which is indeed sometimes speaking to the public is not something that you will think about when it comes, because I wouldn't say because it's underdeveloped or developed or anything, but because countries are different. The way you speak to people is different. So you have to learn everything. So I would say, to me, public diplomacy is indeed for everyone, in a sense that it's also a chance, and it's a set of tools that you can use, and they're not very costly. I wouldn't say that, let's say 20 years ago, because the game was completely different. But I think public diplomacy, everyone can use it, and it's not a matter of finance, it's a matter of story. But now to return to what you say, to return to the fact that indeed in some countries you would speak about speaking to authorities first. I've seen Lebanon, for instance, which is the country I would say I know, one of the countries I know the best because I lived there. I wrote a book about it. I even get married to a Lebanese. I know that if you want to speak to people, actually, you will not speak to people directly. I always advise that you speak, of course, to politicians, but also to religious leaders, which are amazingly important in Lebanon. And if you forget about them, well, you will have some problems, in a sense that if you say, well, I'm not going to do that because that's not my matters, you will have huge problems. You will not reach people. Now, if you were to come to, let's say, France, and you say, I'm going to speak to religious leaders, that will also be a faux pas. You will not do that. I mean, they don't have the same importance as in Lebanon. So public diplomacy, anyway, is a set of tools that has to be adapted to the country or the place or the city. But the most important thing is always think about your target, in a sense that if you speak about seduction, and I know that it's a term that is complicated to translate, because depending on the region, it doesn't mean the same thing. But you always have to think about what kind of seduction you have and for whom. So it also really depends. And in the history of public diplomacy, some people came up with different terms. Like I remember, I think 10 years ago, I went to a conference and I had a colleague from Egypt who say, well, we don't say public diplomacy, we say people's diplomacy. But it didn't really hold because for me, I didn't really see the difference between public and people. For me, it's pretty much the same. Of course, I understand there are some nuances, but I would say it really depends on the audience, on who you're trying to reach. And so as much as I think it's a very interesting question, I think I could answer maybe better if, for instance, I had like one precise example, because it is true that the way you're going to communicate truly depends on your target audience, the manners, society, the customs, and things like this. I was speaking about Lebanon, for instance, also even inside of Lebanon, which is quite a tiny country. If you forget about leaders of tribes, if you forget about, for instance, if you go to a village and you only speak to the mayor, you'll have a problem because you also have to speak to the chief, which is a different function than the mayor. And so all things have to be included. And that's what makes communication and diplomacy so exciting. And when you bring them together, you have public diplomacy, which is amazingly complex, extremely exciting. But this kind of question also is the one that keeps me, I would say, thinking about public diplomacy in a sense that indeed you don't have one way to communicate. And that is indeed sometimes the problem of some countries like, United States, France, Britain. Sometimes we believe that everybody should communicate like us, because we have been or we are world powers. Therefore, we sort of impose our way of thinking everywhere we go. And that's a massive mistake in the 21st century, indeed. So I'm not sure I answer your question, but I think it's actually something interesting to think about indeed.
I know it calls for much further reflection, because very often we find when we go into Western capitals or the Western world, or some of the more developed countries, I mean, you can take countries like Japan or South Korea even, you are scrambling to make sure that connectivity is established at the highest levels of governance, because that is what is lacking. In Colombo, I'm sure the US ambassador, the French ambassador, the British High Commissioner, they could pick up the phone, ask for an appointment, meet with the head of state, meet with the minister. They could do that. It doesn't happen vice versa in the other way around in the other capitals. And this is where countries are scrambling to do that. Very often you hear of companies that are hired in order to make connections. I know in America, there are several of those companies which try to help you get appointments on Capitol Hill, etc. So that's where countries, I guess, focus more. Financial resources are devoted more for that. I guess that's why that question also came up. Sagarika is asking the question about the European Union and what is the real success between the European Union's public diplomacy. I guess this is coming from the point, Etienne, where we're saying the European Union is many diverse countries, many languages, a lot of diversity across, but of course it's come together. It's a wonderful model of multilateralism. How is the EU able to engage in public diplomacy given the diversity?
I'm laughing a bit because that's every time we discuss this among colleagues, like I was really sad about Brexit in the sense that I enjoy the UK. I studied there. My brother is married to an English lady. It's a country that for me is very natural. I like it very much. And so I was saddened by Brexit indeed. But the thing is, well, they have their own way. Now we have ours, but we don't really know what is ours in a sense that I spoke with people from the European Commission, from the European in general, and you can find a lot of people which are very smart, very interesting. I remember the equivalent of the ambassador for the European Commission was in The Hague, and he was a wonderful man. He was from Belgium, very wise, very interesting, fantastic to speak to. But every time I ask the question, I say, well, I'm sorry, but I always have the same question for you all, which is, where do you see the European Union in 10 years? And I never gotten an answer ever, because every time the answer is, well, it's a question of consensus, so we have to decide. It's extremely complicated. Now, if we speak about just communication, I also spoke with people working for the communication of the European Union, and they usually do a pretty bad job because indeed they don't really know what the identity of the EU is. We see, well, we are a young organization, to be honest. If you look at it, it's only been, just a few decades that we're together, that we are those 27 nations now. And so, if you look at the United States of America, also extremely different states that came together, the latest one being in 1949, Hawaii and Alaska. It took them quite some time. And even today, they don't have the same identity. I mean, I live in California and also on the East Coast, and it's very diverse. But at least they have some kind of common values, some common ideas about the futures and things like this, which I'm afraid we don't really have in the EU. And so when Brexit happened, I was, of course, saddened, but I was also wondering what kind of story we should provide so that the British people would actually feel like they also belong, in a sense that I cannot understand the xenophobia of some people who voted leave, saying, well, we don't want migrants, we want to regain control of the borders. All of this for me makes absolutely no sense. But I also spoke to some people actually in academia, and I say, well, are you going to vote leave or stay? And they say, well, we don't like it, but we're going to vote for leave because we don't exactly understand where everybody's going. So maybe if nobody knows where to go, maybe we would be better on our own. And it's something I can sort of respect. And so the European Union so far, in terms of public diplomacy, we don't really know. I mean, now they have stronger personality. I think most people know about Ursula von der Leyen, when before we didn't really know who was running the EU. Well, she's not the only one running the EU. You also have Charles Michel, different people. But indeed, I don't have an answer for this because nobody has an answer. And every time I get something very bureaucratic, which is, well, we speak about 27 different nations, and so we cannot decide for the future. But if you don't have a story, if you don't have a direction, indeed, at some point, you're going to face an even bigger problem than Brexit. So I think we're all very concerned about this. I like the idea of Europe very much. I like the European Union bureaucracy way less. And as a citizen of the EU, indeed, I would like to get some answers. And so far, I'm quite critical about their communication. I'm quite critical about their direction. I'm quite critical about their values. And what I hear is that mostly it's countries coming together for economic interest. They have the same economic interest. But when it comes to values, the problem is when we speak about a country like Turkey, which has been knocking on the door of the EU for decades, we still don't really know what to say and why they shouldn't be part of the same club. It makes me very uncomfortable in the sense that why not Turkey? Why not Russia, for instance? Let's imagine for a second, why not Russia? Russia could also be an amazing add to the European Union. But that's the thing. If you return to public diplomacy, if you don't have a good story, you cannot communicate about it. That's the thing. And so I think that's the biggest problem with the EU. They don't have a story. They have a history. They have crisis that they dealt with in pretty good way so far. We still survive. But I'm sort of concerned about the future. I'm way more concerned about the future of the United Kingdom, to be honest. I think the United Kingdom may not have a bright future in the coming years. If you see it's what's happening, especially in Scotland, but also Northern Ireland and to a lesser extent Wales. So I think the UK has less of a future than the European Union, but I'm also very concerned about the European Union. So about this, I don't really know what to say. Even if I sort of see what people have in common in Europe between French, Swedes, Dutch, I can sort of see what kind of values we have to a certain extent, but that's Europe. In a sense that Europe existed before the European Union. So about the European Union, I'm afraid I don't really know, because every time I ask, I asked several times, always the same question, I never gotten an answer. So.
No, that's fine. That's perfect. So Sagarika is asking a follow-up to that point where she's asking, with the departure of Angela Merkel, do you think this is going to have a huge impact on the EU?
I need to forget that I'm French and focus more on my other half of being Swiss. It's a complicated combination being French and Swiss, to be honest. They sort of oppose each other at some point. Because as a French, I wanted to say, well, it's fantastic for us because now Macron is the leader. But it's not completely true, in a sense that many people say actually it's more the Prime Minister of Italy, Mr. Draghi. I'm not sure I can answer this question, to be honest, because all I can say is speculate about the future. I think Angela Merkel it was undisputed that she was the true leader of the European Union. I think even the French can acknowledge this, that she was the strong person, of course, because she had a very strong economy. It's also the biggest country in Europe and so forth and so on, and also in the European Union. But with her departure, we don't really know. We have no idea. I would, again, I'm going to speak more like a Swiss. As a half Swiss, I think it's actually maybe a good thing in a sense that so far France and Germany have been taking most of the decisions about the future of the European Union. And maybe in the future, if some alliances like Visegrad, which is, Hungary and Czech Republic and Slovakia and Poland, if those ensemble of countries actually have more weight in the future of the European Union, it would be a good thing. Personally, I think that it shouldn't be France and Germany leading the way, paving the way. I would prefer like the Dutch, the Swedes, these kind of countries which are smaller, but also very interesting, which have very interesting answers to current problems and crises. I think I would like to see those very innovative countries to be more in charge. And I'm going back to being French. Sounds like a good idea, but of course we have to also confront the fact that the European Union is mostly an economic union, and so far France, Germany, and Italy are the biggest countries in the European Union. So I think in the future, unfortunately, nobody will say, well, we think that it's more the small economies like Sweden and Netherlands we should run the show. I think I like Angela Merkel. I think it's kind of hard to find people who didn't like her for many reasons. I think she was amazingly dedicated to what she did. I like her simplicity. I like also her strength. I think she was a wonderful example for women in politics, which is something we dearly need in the European Union and anywhere else in the world. But the fact that she leaves and that Germany is actually a bit weaker on a political level could also be an opportunity, but I hope that it's an opportunity for innovative and smart nations, but I don't have very high hopes. Again, if we don't know what the EU should be in 10 years, I think this is a problem that we should solve before thinking about leadership. You need a direction before you need a captain.
True, very true. So Trivan is asking a question leading into the communication area and the social media aspect, where he says, the French film, I hope I'm pronouncing it correctly, Ce que vous croyez, Who You Think I Am, brings into discussion the dysfunctional behavior of adults who want to act young and do what they couldn't do on social media during their teens and 20s. This indeed has had an impact on the stability of the most important social unit, the family, and maybe the adult itself. Therefore, do you think that the very foundation of socially accepted norms might change in the future to meet these dynamics, which are being influenced by the virtual world into the real world? A division between those who accept this change and those who don't. Do you think that's going to happen?
About change. So I left my students at Erasmus University. I told them, please accept change. And if you don't accept change, then change is going to do something for you that you will not be happy about. So of course, you mentioned Darwin. Darwin is all about change, survival of the fittest. And if you look at the history, not just of societies, but of humanity, it's all about changes and being able to anticipate the changes. Now, I'm not completely sure because the French movie you referred to, I never heard of. So I don't know what it is. I cannot tell you anything about it. But if I understand correctly, we speak about changes which are introduced by social media, by things that sometimes come outside of societies. I don't really have a general answer for this. I would say I'm very happy. For instance, we were talking many times about the whole council movement in the world, which means that when somebody has done something bad 10 years ago, that person can still be considered accountable. I think sometimes it goes too far, but I'm also extremely happy that finally some people are held accountable for their actions. I think for too many years, mostly some men were using their power, their domination for things that nobody asked them. Nobody held them accountable. So I cannot really answer again. Not having seen this movie, and it's a very interesting question. But maybe we should find some case studies to discuss. But I would say change is essential. Change is happening. The only thing is that change should actually be something accepted and also something we understand and accompany, and something that we sort of contribute to, not something that is imposed from the outside. So I'm not sure I answer the question like this, but change has to happen. Sometimes the outside influence is a good thing, but also it's up to societies to understand, to wisely. I know that speaking about wisdom is not something we do anymore. It seems that we don't really live in a world where wisdom is considered to be virtue. For me, it's a massive virtue. But I think sometimes it's also wise to accept certain change from the outside and refuse some others. It really depends on societies. Strong societies accept change, weak societies refuse it, and that's also the problem. That's usually their downfall. So once again, I'm afraid it's a bit disappointing as an answer. Mm-hmm. And I promise I will watch the movie that you mentioned.
I mean, you've raised so many points today, Etienne. Thank you so much. Ambassador Pamela Dean also sends a message saying you have exposed new avenues of public diplomacy, especially in talking about the future. Some of those aspects that you touched on really allude to some very, very vital points that we need to be thinking. Finally, before we close, Etienne, if you can just very briefly tell us, the audience is predominantly Sri Lankan today. We have some young academics joining us. We have some ambassadors joining us. Can you tell us, Etienne, from a Sri Lankan perspective, or try to look at it from a Sri Lankan perspective, how effectively do you think we need to be using public diplomacy, especially in our interactions? You know, this country has faced a lot of issues, a lot of problems we've faced in the past. We've had a conflict which we've come through. It's been more than a decade now. Probably communication has been a huge factor with the international community in terms of getting the message across. This is the only country in the world that has defeated terrorism, which is very often forgotten or swept under the carpet or not being discussed at all. What do you think? What is the takeaway you can give us in terms of where should we be going? What should we be looking at? What should we focus on in engagement with the international community?
So I remember that when we had sessions with Sri Lanka in Cleandale, I wouldn't say a long time ago, but let's say 4 years ago, it was a success story. I was very happy because I'm trying to use a lot of scientific methodology, for instance, rankings about nation branding, things like this, which is not completely scientific, but it's also a way to sort of illustrate. It's a way to also go beyond beliefs and to go beyond stereotypes. And Sri Lanka was such a success story. I was very happy because I do remember one session. I don't know if you were part of this session, but in the end, actually, we're discussing this. And I was asked by people, by diplomats from Sri Lanka, so what do you think we should do? And I say, I'm very happy and also a bit sad to say, well, you're doing super well, honestly, from my opinion, you're doing amazingly well. You know, one of the success stories. And of course, some events in the past happen, and now the image of Sri Lanka is damaged, of course. The thing is, when you speak about terrorism, France is a country that has been suffering from terrorism for decades. We had a lot of terrorism. Recently, we had the Bataclan and Charlie Hebdo, which probably you heard about. So we still have terrorism. But if you look at the number of tourists, every year we have more tourists. Recently, so for 2019, now we have 89 million tourists coming to France, and most of them visit Paris. So it's also a difference between a reputation that is steady for decades and a reputation that public diplomacy works on a reputation, but you speak about decades. You cannot just build this in years. So I think that's the problem of Sri Lanka, which is that you did an amazing job at building the reputation of Sri Lanka as a place that is wonderful for tourism. Mention my brother. I'm going to mention my other brother, who actually went to Sri Lanka 4 years ago, and he could not stop talking about it. I had to tell him to stop because he was so enthusiastic. And so I think that you did indeed a very good job, but understand that reputations are built indeed on over decades. If you speak about France or Great Britain or United States, I mean, countries which are constantly in the top 5 or 10 or anything, countries which have a tremendous attraction. You have the American dream. And when you speak about Paris, it's the city of love and things. So you speak about countries which have decades of experience in public diplomacy. So in the case of Sri Lanka, I think you did before. And really, it was really one of the great success story of, I would say, the past 10 years. Sri Lanka is definitely one of the success story. And of course, reality was harsh. We're following this on the screens, but I think it means that it can be done again with pretty much the same idea, the idea of a tolerant country, of a beautiful country, of also great stories, great products. That there are many products from Sri Lanka that we use. And I would say it can indeed be done again. It's been damaged, but the reputation can come back. I would say, from my point of view, it's just a bump on the road. But again, remember, I'm not from Sri Lanka. You are from Sri Lanka. You know the country way better than I do. And so for me, it's just a bump on the road. And that's also what I want to believe. And I hope that's what it is. So I think in the future, just doing what you did before, because it was quite amazing to go from the reputation of a country that was poor, that many people confused with other countries in Asia, you know, like Bangladesh or Sri Lanka, whatever, not completely sure what it is. But your branding was excellent. People knew about it. It was a great destination for tourism. I think the tourism went skyrocketing in a few years. So I think it can still be done. And I think also for people to understand what you've done, what you've been through, is also a great way to, I'm going to use the term, to seduce them. You can also seduce people with stories, and the best stories are usually about drama. I hope I don't sound too cynical about it, but I think also when I look at countries that I know quite well, like South Africa, one of the reasons I love South Africa or Ireland is also because of the wounds, of the story, of the things that, you know, you go to a place also to feel some empathy with the people, not just to go with people who have been happy, but to go there to also feel their stories, and many stories, many beautiful stories also sad.
I guess that's a very strong point there that you mentioned, storytelling, stories. You must have a story. If you have a story, you're going to have something effective to convey. And Sri Lanka certainly has a lot of stories, as you give the example with South Africa, with its island, wherever it may be. Those stories carry a very huge amount of weight. And this is a huge benefit in the world of public diplomacy, where if you use stories, if you're able to convey that, people want to listen. People like stories. We like to listen to stories. We want to know about things. And of course, I'm sure your brother, even during his travels, would have come and told you a lot of stories, people he met, places he went to, things he ate, maybe a whole list of things. The list would have gone on.
Oh, yeah.
And that's, I guess, public diplomacy. public diplomacy at another level, at least taking that first step in terms of storytelling. But thank you so very much, Etienne, for taking time to speak to us. You really opened dimensions on public diplomacy, not in terms of just looking at how it has been evolving in the current context, but what we're going to see in the future and what we should be ready for. Whether it is from a geographical perspective or from a political perspective, especially even revisiting that whole concept of social media. Is it social? Is it actually media? These are questions that you gave us to think about. Thank you so very much. So on behalf of everyone who's joined us, thank you once again on behalf of the Awarelogue Initiative too for joining us on this session. Dr. Etienne F is someone who is very well known at the Klingendale. He is someone who taught me when I was at the Klingendale many years ago, and it was great to reconnect with him once again and to invite him, and we're very thankful that you accepted our invitation. At the University of Erasmus in the Netherlands, you handle a very vital area in terms of communication, history, culture, the department that you're affiliated with. So thank you so much for sharing your experience, your expertise, and your skills with us on this particular session. So to everyone who joined, thank you so much for sending in the questions. The Awarelogue Initiative will be having another session of the Awarelogue Lecture Forum at the end of November, where we will be speaking about the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, which is marking a very significant anniversary this year. And we're going to be examining where the SCO is going and prospects and perspectives of what exactly is happening in multilateralism in that part of the world. That's on our next session of the Awarelogue Lecture Forum. So until then, thank you once again. Thank you very much, Etienne, once more for giving us your time. And thank you to everyone who joined us.
Thank you very much. Pleasure to be here. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank
Bye.
you. Have a great day. Bye.